So when last we met, I talked about 2018's Bloodstained Curse of the Moon, the so-called prequel minigame inspired heavily by the old-school Castlevania titles of the NES. To quickly sum up my review of it, if you're a fan of the NES Castlevanias and haven't played the game for yourself yet, I highly recommend checking it out. Chances are you own something that the game was released on, and it's only $10. For what was really just a secondary project released as a Kickstarter stretch goal, there was quite a bit of effort that went into it, and I'd fire it up and play it any day. If you want a more in-depth look at it, go check out my review of it, or better yet, go play it yourself. But Curse of the Moon was merely an appetizer, and in June 2019, we were officially served the main course, Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. The title is a little on the nose about what it was inspired by, but how is the game itself? Well, before I get into that, I want to talk about my own personal history with both it and the games it draws its inspiration from. When it comes to the Castlevania series, I'll be the first to admit that I'm more of a fan of the post-Symphony of the Night titles, or as fans have gone on to name it, the Metroidvania style games. The ones where you don't explore levels in the traditional sense, but sectioned off areas of a much larger game world. There have been games that have gone on to use this style of gameplay, such as, obviously, the Metroid games, but a few others to use this style would be examples like the Shantae games, Hollow Knight, and Axiom Verge, just to name a scant few. As I've stated earlier, 1997's Castlevania Symphony of the Night uses this style, and ended up becoming something of a revolution for the series as a whole. So much so that this would become the default style for nearly all of the Castlevania games afterward. And it was around this period where I started getting into the series. Castlevania Circle of the Moon, which, fun fact, was a launch title for the Game Boy Advance, was the first Castlevania game that I ever bought, and as soon as I played it, I was immediately hooked. And I played this game on an original model GBA with no backlight, so the struggle to find a good position to hold my GBA in for a good view was hella real. I bought every game that came out after that on the GBA and DS, and those games would go on to be some of my absolute favorite games of all time. The last game in the series to use this style of gameplay would be 2008's Castlevania Order of Ecclesia for the DS. Okay, I guess technically Harmony of Despair, but that was kind of a different game. But Order of Ecclesia was the last Castlevania game I played when it was brand new. And then a few years later, the series went on in a completely different direction than the one that initially won me over, so it's been a while since I played a Metroidvania game that really stole my soul. But anyway, what ended up happening was Koji Igarashi, who had served as the producer of the Castlevania series since Symphony of the Night, left Konami in 2014 and eventually launched a Kickstarter for his new game with his new company, Artplay. That game was Bloodstained Ritual of the Night, and it would go on to accrue over $5.5 million on Kickstarter, making it the highest ever grossing Kickstarter campaign for a video game before being dethroned by Shenmue 3 just a few short months later. Bloodstained was originally planned for a release all the way back in 2017 on pretty much everything, including macOS, Linux, and even the Nintendo Wii U, which was Nintendo's main home console at the time. But that version ran into some issues when it was revealed that the Wii U didn't support Unreal Engine 4, the engine that powered the game. But it wouldn't be long before Nintendo announced the Switch, so Artplay made the Switch. I'm sorry. The game ended up needing to be delayed again to make major changes to the game's graphics, which apparently got a lot of fan outcry over how bad they looked. Honestly, if you want a way more in-depth look at the development history of Bloodstained, I would highly recommend this video by StopSkeletonsFromFighting. Link below if you somehow haven't seen it yet. It's an interesting watch. I will say that while the PC, PS4, and Xbox One versions still made it to market, the Wii U version was shifted over to the Switch, and the Mac, Linux, and PS Vita versions of the game were sadly cancelled. Alright, enough on the development history, let's get into the real meat of the video. And please keep in mind that everything in this video is all coming from somebody who did not back the game on Kickstarter. In the late 1700s, during Europe's Industrial Revolution, a group of alchemists begin to fear that the people's faith is fading as science comes more and more into relevance. In an attempt to reinstate people's faith and to keep their wealthy patrons in check, they do what any good benevolent group would do: summon demons to Earth.
Oh yeah, that makes sense.
In order to control these demons, the alchemists begin experimenting on humans by grafting crystals attuned to demonic energy, and began offering them as sacrifices. After many of these sacrificial lambs, known as shardbinders, were sacrificed, they were all presumed dead except for two. There's Miriam, who was spared the rite altogether due to falling comatose shortly before the rite could begin, and Jeeble, Miriam's friend, who inexplicably survives the ritual. 10 years after the ritual, Miriam awakens from her coma to find that Jeeble has begun the ritual anew, having summoned an entire castle as his stronghold. Having promised to stop Jeeble if his powers overtook his sense of reasoning, Miriam and her alchemist friend Johannes set out to stop him. And that's where the game opens proper. We join our hero Miriam
Babe alert!
on a ship on her way to Jeeble's last known location. The ship is suddenly attacked by demons, and it isn't long before we find none other than Jeeble himself being accompanied by a demon, which is very out of character for him. Wanting to not only get to the bottom of this, but also save Europe from the approaching demon threat, Miriam heads off to the mysterious demonic castle where Jeeble awaits. All of the characters from Curse of the Moon are here. In addition to Miriam and Jeeble, Alfred is also here, and so is Zangetsu, who is voiced by Solid Snake himself, David Hayter.
Dummy thick.
After establishing a hub of sorts where you can save, teleport, and buy and craft items, you begin the game proper. And if you've ever played any of the post-Symphony of the Night Castlevanias, or any of the indie games that were inspired by it, you're gonna feel right at home here. The game world consists of many big, opened areas, sectioned off and given their own themes and enemy types. And I never found backtracking to be a huge issue because A, you can teleport when you reach the appropriate room, and B, you have access to a mini-map that you can modify in a number of ways, from its position on the screen, to the transparency, to how zoomed in it is. It really makes up for not having a second screen dedicated to the map. Also, like the post-Symphony games, there are RPG elements here as well. You'll level up by slaying demons, you can get status ailments, use items to heal and cure yourself of said status ailments, the whole 9 yards. You can just mash the attack button over and over again to defeat enemies, but the game also implements special combo attacks for when you have certain weapons equipped, in what I can only assume to be an attempt to circumvent what would have been repetitive gameplay. In addition to having access to many types of weapons such as daggers, swords, greatswords, axes, lances, whips, and even pistols, Miriam's Shardbinder powers allow her to use a large variety of special powers gained from fallen enemies. Occasionally when you kill a demon, you'll gain a power from them in the form of a shard, which looks like it hurts like hell going in. This is very similar to the two Castlevania games Aria of Sorrow and Dawn of Sorrow, where powers can be gained from slain enemies. These shards will give you a whole host of attack options, special active and passive abilities, and stat boosts. One of my personal favorites to use on boss fights and tougher enemies was one called Acid Jet, which poisons enemies for additional damage. These shard powers were a lot of fun to use, and can even be upgraded to be even more useful. You can even sell ones you're not using and make a good bit of gold that way. You can arrange weapons and shards to fit your own personal playstyle. For me personally, I mostly stuck to standard swords for their attack speed, and great swords for their damage output at the expense of speed. Though I eventually started sticking to the one-handed swords for their greater attack speed, and not leaving myself open for enemy attacks. Eventually I found a shard that enhanced the attack speed of whips, so I ended up finding them to be a pretty viable weapon type after a while. There are different kinds of guns in the game too, but I found them to be too slow, and the ammo you get for them is pretty finite. The standard ammo you get is infinite, but the damage output was too low for me to really find them to be a viable option. But of course, everyone is going to play this game a little differently, so chances are you may end up finding them to be a little bit more useful than I did. There's also two separate types of crafting in this game. You can craft weapons, armor, and accessories from items that can be found in chests or dropped from dead enemies. And the other is a cooking system wherein you can cook food items with ingredients that, too, are found in chests, dropped from dead enemies, or even harvested from one of the NPCs. The first time you eat a completed dish, you'll receive a permanent stat boost. There's also a side quest where you can cook food for this old lady who will reward you with items. In addition to cooking food for this bottomless pit of an old lady, there's demon hunting quests where you can hunt down and kill a certain number of certain types of enemies and give items to the gravekeeper to bury with the villagers who fell victim to the village attack. All of these can land you extra goodies. And in case the footage you're seeing hasn't clued you in yet, there's even character customization options. Once you reach a certain area, you can give Miriam different hairstyles, give her different colors for her hair, her eyes, her costume, even her skin. And you best believe I took full advantage of that. I am an absolute sucker for character customization in games, and I love that this was here. And because all the cutscenes run in real time, she keeps whatever you give her during cutscenes. Same goes for any transformations she may have active. As stated earlier, each of the levels have their own unique designs and feel pretty self-contained. Of course, this being a spiritual successor to Castlevania, the gothic atmosphere is pretty heavy in some places. But then you also get areas like caves, mechanized libraries, and even an Asian-themed area, just to name a few. You're on a 2D plane the entire game, but the camera will do some neat tricks to make the worlds look more dynamic. And speaking of looks, hot damn does this game look gorgeous. I'll admit, when the game was first announced, I was a little indifferent when they announced a polygonal look for the game instead of the astonishing 2D graphics of the DS games. But since every indie Metroidvania uses 2D graphics now, the polygonal look is a breath of fresh air now. I don't even mind that the game was delayed an extra year if the game ended up looking this good. Some of the areas can look downright stunning too. Even though I'm playing the PC version, I imagine the game will look good on anything that you're playing it on, though I do hear the Switch version has some issues. And it's all topped off by a pretty varied soundtrack as well. Longtime Castlevania composer Michiru Yamane returns to score the soundtrack of this game, and while it might not be my personal favorite soundtrack of hers, it does have some really good stuff on it. And not to mention, this is a surprisingly long game. On my first playthrough on the normal difficulty, it took me about 16 hours. The post-Symphony Vanias usually took me anywhere between 8 to 10 hours to finish, so I wasn't expecting the game to be as big and packed with content as it was. Which, considering that the game MSRPs for $40 American, I'd say is probably a good idea. So with all this praise I just sang about it, can I say that this is a perfect game? Well, no, it's definitely not perfect, but the complaints I have for it are pretty minor. I'd say that my biggest complaint with the game is that there was 1 or 2 areas where items needed for plot progression were hidden in pretty bizarre places. I won't lie, I kinda had to look up a walkthrough a couple of times playing this to figure out where the hell I was supposed to be going. The game does try to alleviate this by having the hot nun Dominique give you clues as to where to go next, but I must have missed the one where she told me I needed a special kind of armor that nullifies damage from environmental hazards. Oh, and speaking of environmental hazards, the later levels in the game are absolutely lousy with them. The Inferno Cave, in particular, has these open pools of molten magma that enemies just love to fling you into. And landing in one of those, or other environmental hazards like spikes, can do over 100 points of damage. And look, I get it, the later levels in video games are supposed to be challenging. But when it gets to a point where enemies are attacking you on all sides, and their attacks can fling you into lava that can take off a good chunk of your health before you've even found the area's save room, it gets to be a little much. And this is one of those games where when you die, you go back to your last save. So if you haven't saved in a while and you die in one of these encounters, then sucks to be you. I'm not saying a game like this necessarily needs checkpoints, but I would like to give you a heads up about it anyway. In fact, those elemental enemies in particular, who can fly around the room and hit you with spells, often when you're fighting other enemies, are just flat out annoying. And so are these Banshee enemies that can hit you with the Curse ailment, which cuts your HP and MP bars in half until you either use a curative item or the effect wears off. And it can still attack you while you're cursed, so keep an eye on your HP meter during these moments. There have been times where I was close to death and didn't even know it. All you get is a small sound that might get drowned out by everything else, and the meter flashing red. But that's it. And for me anyway, the game's voice acting can be a bit hit or miss. I'd put it about on the same levels as a typical anime dub. It's definitely not bad, but I do think some of the deliveries could have been done just a little bit better.
Enough, child. I am here for the book. Jeeble has the book.
I will say, though, that I absolutely love Erica Lindbeck as Miriam.
I apologize for my acquaintance. He had no right to speak to you like that.
Pay it no mind. I've been through worse.
Save some for me?
And this one's a little bit more of a personal rant, but can indie games please stop referencing Shovel Knight? I touched on this a little in my review of Curse of the Moon, but seeing every big Kickstarter indie game get on their knees and slob Shovel Knight's knob is starting to get really old at this point. I'm not calling Shovel Knight a bad game, I'm really not. But that game came out 5 years ago, and I'm just sick to death of seeing every damn Kickstarter indie game reference it. It's almost as annoying as seeing Undertale everywhere now. Oh. Sorry, I think I got a little carried away there. Okay, ran over. The only other thing that I really noticed when I first played this is that there was a bug in the PC version that wasn't letting me pick up items dropped by enemies at first. I would stand right on top of them, and it would take the game a good 5 seconds for it to register that I was trying to pick it up. This seems to have gotten patched out by now, so it was probably just an early bug. One last small thing is that I did notice a real little bit of micro stutter here and there, but I'm not 100% sure if that was the game doing that, or the fact that I was playing it on max settings and trying to record it at 1080p 60 frames per second at the same time. Just the risky run trying to record PC versions of games, I guess. So to sum it all up, Bloodstained Ritual of the Night is exactly the grand return of IgaVania I was hoping it to be. At first, I thought it would just be a game styled after the latter-day Castlevanias officially produced by Koji Igarashi, and for me personally, I would have been just fine with that. It definitely plays like one of the later Castlevanias, and I wouldn't have it any other way. But the fact that it also includes things like the character customization, the side quests, the crafting systems, hell, even a few extra game modes that I didn't even mention, all thrown into a beefy-ass game, this actually surpassed my expectations in a few ways, and I already had them pretty high since I was a big fan of the games that inspired it. I couldn't find any sales figures, but it looks like the critical reception at least was fantastic. Hell, even Igarashi himself has been talking sequels lately. Well, I hope those plans bear fruit because I would love to see those sequels happen.